I'm curious around the like the change in understanding of like desire, pleasure, and sexual expression throughout like the history of Islam, for example, because as you mentioned before, like that, what we're talking about and what you've written about is probably a bit of a shock to a lot of modern day Muslims, right? And so I'm curious, like just based on your understanding and what you've observed and what you've read, like where do you think that shift started to happen, where the emphasis on female sexuality and female pleasure and just sexual expression in general started to like be stigmatized or taboo, or just started like to be pushed aside?
Yeah. Colonization. So once much of the Muslim world, obviously the Arabian Peninsula, much of Africa and Asia was colonized by the British, a number of these books were either banned, burned, or kind of seen as like barbaric. And a number of the Muslims, the colonized Muslims, even till this day, have kind of interpreted sex and sexuality from, I would say, Victorian Christian mindset, in a sense where sex is viewed as purely for procreational purposes, whereas traditionally, even in, like I said, a lot of the classical books of Islam, sex was about pleasure. So even the Arabic word for marriage, nikah, it's the same meaning as sex, as in the whole point, not like the only goal of marriage is sex, but that's one of the main goals of the purpose of it. And then when they spoke about like marriage, there was so many words. They've got like over 150 words just for sex alone, and even for both the male genitalia and female genitalia. So in classical Arabic, there is, it was very sex positive, or Islam is a very sex positive religion. Whereas the understanding that I think many Muslims have, because of colonization and adopting, you could say, a Victorian, very puritanical outlook in terms of looking at sex and sexuality, is that it's one that is just for procreation, and they have adopted you could say, in terms of because modesty as well, that's a virtuous trait in Islam, right? But how it's been interpreted in some Muslim communities differs. Like, so in some Muslim communities, modesty is like you don't say anything, there's no interaction between the sexes, and for them, this is like an Islamic trait. Right. Whereas in other communities, no, that's like an extreme definition, extreme understanding. And again, like I said, the way, unfortunately, a number of teachers, scholars of today have spoke about these, they ignore a lot of the sexual references from both in the Quran and the time of the Prophet and early Muslim scholars, because they themselves are very uncomfortable with it. But funny enough, well, I say funny is in terms of quite ironic, they're not uncomfortable talking about sexuality when it comes to male sexuality. So when it comes to the issue of men being allowed to marry multiple wives, they'll talk about that. When it comes to a Muslim man is not sexually fulfilled in his marriage, they'll talk about it's okay for you to marry a second wife. But when it comes to what scholars have said in the past, that women have got a God-given right to sexual pleasure, and if she doesn't, or she's not satisfied, she can get divorced, they don't want to talk about those stories. So there is like a bit of cherry picking. So that's and again, because I was fortunate enough to study, the religion in the traditional institute, and I've come across these texts and these references. That's why I wanted to put it out there, because I know there'll be a lot of backlash, and there'll be some people who are actually shocked by this or think this is not from our religion, but then they can see the references and see where it's coming from. It's not just coming from like myself, but yeah, I don't want to just blame, colonization, but I think that definitely had a big role in terms of shaping and changing attitudes towards even how Muslims nowadays view sex and intimacy and ultimately female pleasure. Because like I said, when it comes to, because initially I always used to say pleasure or sexuality, but when I've thought about it, it's actually female pleasure people have more of an issue with as opposed to male pleasure, because we buy into this idea that men always want sex all the time, which I don't believe. I think that's a myth. We buy into this idea that men are or a lot of men are kind of hypersexual when they need multiple women, whereas we don't have that same attitude or level of understanding when it comes to women's sexual needs or the topic of like masturbation. Male masturbation, there's a number of like Muslim scholars of today who talk about it. Okay, yeah, in some cases, or it's perfectly fine, but whereas with women, it's like, no, it's dangerous. What's the rationale behind it? Because if a woman were to masturbate, and these are things I've heard, if a woman were to masturbate and she breaks her hymen, then and she gets married, people may think she's not a virgin, and then she might be executed or killed. And it's like, what? So therefore, that's why I think it's wrong. And it's just like, that's a bit of a stretch. But it's this fear of female sexuality and female pleasure that unfortunately I think in a number of Muslim lands is still like a contentious issue and topic.
Yeah, I appreciate you speaking into that, man. And I kind of had a feeling that was the answer.